How's it going, guys? I'm here with Chapter 32 of Royal Ranger New Beginning. We're going to go ahead and get into it. Danvers Crossing, as the name suggested, was situated on the banks of a small river. Maddie had expected that the crossing might be a shallow ford, but the river was deep and the current swift. Crossing was effected by means of a large flat-bottomed punt, which ran on thick rope cables set on either bank. It was a pleasant-looking village, with its groves of willows stooping down to the water and providing cool, shady retreats along the bank. The gurgle of the river was ever present in the background. Maddie found it to be a soothing sound. Aside from the punt, the village itself was typical of its kind, with a blacksmith, a tavern, a small tannery, a lumber yard with a saw pit, and a seed and grain merchant's shop. Set by a river as it was logical that Danvers Crossing also boasted a flour mill, the massive grinding wheels driven by the fast-flowing river. Farms from the surrounding countryside would bring their grain to the mill to be turned into fine ground flour. In addition to these businesses, there were the villagers' homes, most of them small structures, and all of them single-story, built in the ubiquitous wattle and daub method, with steeply sloping thatched roofs. They stood on either side of the main street. Side lanes between them led to barns and sheds and other outbuildings. All in all, there were about 30 such dwellings. The tannery stood at the near end of the village street. Maddie wrinkled her nose as they trudged past it. "Yuck, what's that dreadful smell?" she asked. Will bent to the shafts of the handcart, looked up at her. "You don't want to know," he said. There was a sizable space between the tannery and the first of the village buildings proper. The next was the smithy, and they could hear the dull clink of hammer on metal and the rhythmic roar of the bellows as the blacksmith's assistant kept a constant draught under the bed of glowing charcoal. It was a logical arrangement, and one that could be found in most villages. Businesses like the tannery, with its unpleasant smell, and the smithy, with its inherent risk of fire, were kept at arm's length from the houses, the taverns, and inns. A few villagers were on the street, and they glanced at the newcomers with interest, and in some cases, suspicion. One or two of them nodded, and Will replied by touching his hand to the battered hat he wore. As they moved farther into the village, he glanced up and saw the 2-story building that stood in pride of place by the riverside. "That'll be the tavern," he said quietly to Maddie. "In a place like this, it'll also serve as the inn, I imagine. We'll head there first." Danvers Crossing was too small to boast a separate tavern and inn, as he had suspected. The building by the river served both purposes, with a long tap room, where meals were also served, and bedrooms for rent on the upper story. There was a grassy bank outside where the tavern keeper would set up tables in good weather, so that patrons could enjoy their ale and their food in sight of the river. Will brought the cart to a stop outside the tavern and straightened up gratefully, stretching the stiffness out of his joints, and massaging the small of his back with a fist. The handcart was a little low for comfort. As a result, the person pushing it was forced to adopt a crouch. He took off his hat and wiped his forehead. Maddie waited impatiently as he slowly surveyed the village and the river. "What now?" she asked, as he glanced at her, shaking his head slightly. "Take your time," he said. "Country folk never hurry. Just relax and smell the roses." She looked around. "Roses? I don't see any roses. The only thing I can smell is horse manure." There was a stable yard and stable beside the tavern. Obviously, it was for use by the tavern's patrons. Equally obviously, there had been more than a few of them, and their horses, in recent times. "Figure of speech," Will said. "I can hardly say, 'Relax and smell the horse dung,' can I?" Maddie allowed a half-smile to twist her lips. The two thoughts don't really go together. Will nodded absently. "Well, we've relaxed enough. Let's go in." As they headed for the door, he said, "Leave the talking to me." "You've told me that. Several times," Maddie replied. He glanced at her. "Just making sure it's sunk in," he said, and led the way inside the tavern. The tavern was dark inside, with only a small window in the sidewall to provide daylight to the tap room. There were 4 lanterns hanging from the central ceiling beam, and a fire flickered in the massive grate to one side. That was for cooking, as well as providing warmth, Maddie realized. The roof beams were low, and even Will, who was not the tallest of men, had to stoop as they made their way into the tavern, approaching the bar. The tavern keeper looked up at them with mild interest. He was busy wiping out a row of tankards. "Something to drink?" he inquired, "and maybe a bite to eat?" Will frowned at him. "Yes to the drink. Ale for me. Small ale, that is." Small ale was ale and water mixed in equal proportions. That is, the proportions were equal if the tavern keeper was honest. All too often, small ale was more water than ale. But it was cheaper, as well, which was why Will ordered it. "What about food?" the innkeeper asked again, as he placed a tankard in front of Will. "We've a good chicken stew today, chicken with dumplings and farm vegetables, and a good crusty loaf for 3 pennies a serve." Will pursed his lips, considering. "We'll share one," he said. The price was actually more than reasonable, but he was playing the role of an itinerant worker, and such men had to watch their coins. "Be an extra coin for a second plate and spoon," the innkeeper replied. Will scowled at him. He snorted. "I suppose I've no choice. All right, then." The innkeeper gestured to Mattie. "Will she want something to drink? I've fresh cider if she wants." "Water will do her fine," Will said, maintaining his penny-pinching character. The innkeeper poured Mattie a beaker of water and shouted their food order to an unseen worker in the kitchen behind him. He leaned his elbows on the bar as Will and Mattie sat opposite him. "Traveling through?" he asked. He was friendly enough, probably wondering if he could rent them a room, Will thought. "Traveling, yes," Will replied. "Whether we go on through depends on whether I can find work here." "That might be a possibility," said the tavern keeper. "What sort of work are you looking for?" Will shrugged. "Anything I can turn my hand to, most things. Farm work, fencing, repair work, carpentry, you name it." "Not much farm work at the moment," the innkeeper said, "but I've got a few repairs need doing round the tavern here. Carpentry and some painting." Will looked up at him, interest in his eyes, at the prospect of work. "Well, I'm your man for that." He held out his hand. "William's the name. William Accord. This here's my daughter Mattie." They shook hands. "Good day to you, Mattie," said the innkeeper. Then speaking to Will again, "My name's Rob. Rob Danvers." Will raised his eyebrows in interest. "Danvers? Is this village name for you, then?" Rob Danvers shook his head. "My great-grandfather," he said. "He built the first punt across the river. Mind you, in those days there were all sorts of brigands and bandits in these parts. Not like today." "Aye, things have quieted down in recent years," Will answered. "So how many days' work do you think you'd have for me?" Danvers shrugged. 2 or 3, maybe, but you'd have a good chance of picking up more if you're here in the tavern. And I'll put in a good word for you. You could rent a room here for you and your daughter. Be right on site." Will wrinkled his nose at the idea, and the expense. "Rather sleep in your stables, if that's no problem to you," he said. Danvers shrugged. "Suit yourself. Be cheaper that way, but a good deal draftier." "We'll rug up," Will told him. "By the way, while I'm working, I'll need someone to look after Mattie here. I don't want her running wild all over the place. Any of the village women be prepared to do that sort of thing?" A young girl emerged from the kitchen with their food. Will took a bite, chewed and swallowed before he spoke again. Mattie piled into hers with gusto. After a long morning on the road, the chicken stew was delicious. She glanced up at Will's next question. "Someone in the next village said there was a family here whose daughter had moved away. Maybe they'd be interested?" Will paused, pretending to search for the name. Clover it was. Said their girl was about Mattie's age. Rob Danvers's face clouded over. He stood up abruptly. "Carrie Clover didn't move away," he said shortly. Will raised his eyebrows in surprise. "So she's still here, then?" Danvers shook his head. "She disappeared. Some weeks back. Just disappeared one night." "Run away, did she?" Will asked. The innkeeper paused, then replied, "I wouldn't be too surprised. Her parents didn't treat her so well. You'd often see her with bruises on her face, or red eyes from crying. Pity, too. She was a likable little thing. Maybe she met a boy and ran off with him. Wouldn't be the first time." But Danvers shook his head once more. "Had a boy she was sweet on. He's still here. No, you ask me, she got tired of the beatings and ran off." He leaned forward conspiratorially. "Unless, of course, someone took her." "Took her? For what? Danvers shook his head. Don't know. Maybe for ransom? Is her family well off then? Will asked. But Danvers shook his head, negating his own theory. Father's a plowman, just manages to make ends meet. He'd never be able to pay a ransom. Then why abduct her if you knew there was no chance of any ransom? Danvers moved his head back and forth as he pondered the question. He hadn't really considered his theory in any depth before. He was simply used to saying, in darkest tones, that somebody took her. Dunno, but she's gone. That I know. He paused. Was I you, I wouldn't go asking the family about it neither. Clover's a bad-tempered type, likely to fly off the handle if he thinks you're blaming him for her going. Will considered the point for a few seconds, then nodded his head in agreement. Thanks for the warning, he said. If I run across him, I'll make sure I don't mention it. He paused, as if digesting that thought, finished off his meal, then glanced at Mattie. Well, come along, girl. Eat up, and let's get our things into the stable. Like as not, it'll rain before dark. He swallowed the last of his beer, nodded to Danvers, and turned for the door, Mattie following. All right, guys, that's it for Chapter 32. Thank you for everybody for joining me. I'll see you next time in Chapter 33. God bless, and have a good one.